Gaming is an unstoppable force. It's a medium that moves hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And even musical artists, movies, sports, and TV shows are trying to cross into that space with collabs. Investors are always trying to turn profits with their shares held in something. And gamers are always looking for new, enjoyable releases. Hype is very interesting as a concept because it determines how much interest a game has before it releases, and it affects how much people talk about it after release. But make no mistake, I do not think that hype and value are the same thing, and I just argued that art is not a measure of accolades in my previous video. Similarly, the hype a game has isn't telling you whether it's going to leave a mark on some or any of the people that play the game. Let's start with a controversial opinion. I think that a lot of hype is very inorganic, and in fact, a lot of it is manufactured through marketing. While there are legitimate reasons for people to get excited about games on a case-by-case basis like a new sequel or a particular developer working on a project, oftentimes the scale of exposure is mostly due to advertisement and paid influencing around it. I'm not saying that every single banger game that people rave on about is an industry plant, but I do believe that a hefty marketing budget will make you think you need something more than you do. That's kind of the point of marketing in the first place. Nobody really needs the things that you want to sell them, especially not a video game. You just have to convince them that they do. Not all hype is the product of marketing. Sometimes a game becomes extremely famous because of one moment, whether it was at a press conference, a memorable trailer, or making some enticing promises that aren't realizable by the end of the development deadline. You can't really compare the average Ubisoft game and its immense marketing budget to the success that Undertow amassed. One has a gigantic budget and the other was funded through Kickstarter. One thing is clear. Hype is deeply linked to expectations, so it's extremely crucial that you are clear about what a game is, what it isn't, and don't overpromise on something you can never deliver on, because you might not get the opportunity to prove to people that your game will eventually become an enjoyable experience for them. Let's ask some basic questions. What are some questionable means of generating hype? How does hype affect how we consume games? And what are the consequences of living up to the hype for both gamers and developers? I'll talk about different games to answer these questions so we can gradually come to an understanding of why I think the pursuit of hype is one of the worst things about contemporary gaming. It's kind of funny to define a function for what hype is because that's essentially the central objective of marketers. They want to figure out how to make something succeed through building hype. They're looking at metrics, like what demographics are we targeting, how can we leverage the story, the devs, the IP, and the gameplay, and a number of other inputs to spin a campaign that convinces people that they need something. I don't think that there's any surefire way to catch lightning in a bottle, but a good bet is usually making a good game. But the belief that something is good is quite subjective, which is why even though you can temper your expectations, that marketing might make you more excited for a game than you might otherwise have been. I played Final Fantasy XIII when I was a kid, and it was probably the first game I ever felt disappointed in. While the gaming community at large was quite different back then and some people were just mad that the protagonist is a woman, I just felt disappointed by the presentation of ideas. A lot of the cool lore is not in exposition, but it's hidden away in reading. It's been quite a few years since I replayed it last, but even though the combat, music, and voice acting is great, the game just didn't do it for me. There are many reasons I could give for why that game disappointed me, but I think the main reason, after all this time, was because of the expectations I held because it was a Final Fantasy game. I got good graphics and all the core systems of a JRPG, but I just felt disappointed that there was no world map, no towns. Even though the game was beautiful, I still felt like it was empty to me. I was just a kid and I was cognizant of all these gripes, but it was one of the first times that I understood what expectations can do to your enjoyment of a game. On its face, FF13 has fantastic combat, and I think you'd struggle to find someone that can actually make a decent case for why the combat is bad. 13 achieves the majority of its design objectives and does them quite effectively, but despite the core being good, I wouldn't say that I liked the very first game. I couldn't really hide my disappointment as a kid playing a new game. I got to that final chapter and I just put it down. I didn't look back, I didn't blink, and I played Uncharted 2 instead. Had I gone into this not really thinking about what the game could be in reference to its predecessors and the ideas and systems that were in those games, I probably wouldn't have had such a negative impression. But I was a kid, and while it's easy to dismiss my gripes as just being immature, I think that there is a lot of validity in saying that even as a child I understood that my expectations had marred the experience for me. There is a much more elaborate discussion to be had about whether those expectations of a franchise matter, And that in itself could be a really long-winded case study, especially with the polarizing opinions on FF15, but I have more games I want to talk about than just Final Fantasy. The hype I had for FF13 was something that stems from my attachment to the franchise, not because of how it was marketed to me or the hype I had from that marketing. I wasn't promised anything super unreasonable, I was just a kid, excited for a new FF game, and it's also the first game I ever dropped. As a kid, I finished every single game I bought, but FF13 was a notable exception because I just couldn't enjoy it despite the core being good. The weight of my expectations crushed any fun I had with the combat and story out of existence. I want to preface this section by saying that I clearly don't think that harassment and other abusive behaviors are acceptable, nor do I condone harassment campaigns or death threats. In December 2013 at the Spike Video Game Awards, No Man's Sky was shown off to the world where a player was exploring a world, there was mock-up text saying who found the planet, and we go seamlessly from ground to space, and there are ships fighting in the distance. That might seem unimpressive by today's standards, but at this time, Star Citizen and Elite Dangerous had both completed their Kickstarter campaigns, and started drawing a lot of mainstream attention into the realm of flight simulators and space exploration games. The gaming community was primed for the next big thing, and for a time, it seemed that games might be the ticket. The first trailer might seem harmless now, but there were not a lot of games in the space like what was shown, at least very few that were readily playable. You could discover new planets, discover new creatures, and everything was procedurally generated, and it appeared to the public that you could kind of do anything in the game. Innovation and groundbreaking were terms that became synonymous with this game to be, and so, a hype train kicked off. In late 2013, Hello Games' office flooded, destroying a lot of their equipment and progress on the game. This is 3 years prior to its eventual release, so the extent of the damage and the impact on the end product isn't precisely understood. Reported features of the game included that there were 18 quintillion planets, multiplayer, a variety of planet biomes, large-scale space battles, manual space traversal, and many other promises. In early 2016, Jason Schreier, who was notable for having strong industry ties that reliably leak information to him, reported on the delay of No Man's Sky. This led to death threats directed at him because he declared that the game would be delayed and no one wanted to believe it. Prior to release, gameplay leaked because retailers were breaking street dates and flipping copies early. I'm pretty sure at one point someone had posted like tons of elaborate footage of the game on porn sites, because a lot of the footage that was leaked was being posted on YouTube and subsequently taken down by copyright. The leaked gameplay disappointed a lot of people who thought that this game would change their life. A lot of people started spiraling, and they started to think that the game was going to be awful because of the gameplay that they saw on the leaks. In August 2016, No Man's Sky would release, and it was a technical and functional mess. Promised features were missing, a light breeze could crash the game, and a lot of the notable features that people were excited for, such as diverse planetary biomes, large-scale space battles, and multiplayer, were not in the game. The internet was furious with Hello Games, and they raised their pitchforks and harassed the hell out of Sean Murray and Hello Games. And in that response, I think lies a discussion worth having. I'll be frank, Sean Murray got carried away when pressed about the features in the game, and I know that sounds like I'm making excuses on his behalf, but when you watch his interviews, it seems like a nervous guy who was acquiescing to literally anything you could throw at him.
Can you grief other players?
A little bit.
Will there be NPC characters?
No.
Can you customize the look of your character?
Sort of.
Do you ever get a good look at your character?
You can see other characters, and they can see you.
Is there intelligent life in this game?
The players, hopefully.
And he seemed quite nervous in doing that. I think that being an independent developer and being the face of your company can be a problem if you're being convinced to talk on talk shows that millions of people will see, and your ability to communicate is not the greatest. I kinda get how he talked himself into a corner. That doesn't mean that misleading people about features is acceptable, because enticing consumers to buy something under false pretenses puts them at the mercy of refund policies, and the publisher becomes liable for penalties from relevant regulatory bodies. The scale of unending harassment that resulted from this was completely unnecessary, even in light of the lies about what features would be in the game. These days, it's really easy to talk at a game developer on contemporary social media. People throw unrestrained anger at developers as long as they have a righteous cause and use that as an excuse to say that it's acceptable behavior. They think that is accountability. It's not incessant abuse if I mention one thing that's true, while also constantly berating the developer, and sometimes going so far as to harass the friends and family. Over the next 3 years, Hello Games was relatively dark on social media outside of technical updates and support, and they quietly toiled away making the game that they wanted to make, which is when the narrative flipped after a lot of players returned to try the Beyond update. The game updated frequently, piece by piece, moving steadily closer to what they actually wanted to make. The game would eventually add almost everything missing from the launch version of the game, and it's currently above version 4.0, having reached a major update called Waypoint. The game has multiplayer, VR support, numerous biomes, trading and economy mechanics, storylines, and things that were notably missing from the release version of the game. The game used to be mostly negative on Steam, but these days I'm pretty sure it's sitting above the 70s. No Man's Sky was an exercise in a cataclysmic hype train fueled by expectations of hopeful gamers that the next big thing was about to drop. Yes, the lead developer and the face of the company misled people, but it wasn't really out of malice. He was fairly ill-equipped to discuss the scope of his game clearly to the public, and that put a lot of pressure on the company to deliver. While that doesn't make him blameless, what we can take away from the situation is that it's generally bad practice to get overhyped for high concepts that sound too good to be true. Ingenuity is something that people are enamored by, the promise of something great that we've never seen before. While I think the release state of No Man's Sky was quite abysmal, I feel that the gaming community learned a lesson about overhyping anything. And while it isn't their sole responsibility to just know when people are lying, it is our responsibility to exercise restraint when processing our frustration with the hype that went unmatched by a worthwhile experience. I think that even without all the lies, the fact that a hype train crashing could create such a storm of outrage and disappointment is dangerous for gaming as a medium. I'm not fascinated by discussions like, was it a proportionate response or is this a redemption story? To me, they're beside the point. That hype can result in such widespread toxicity is more productive discussion around how hype drives modern video games. Here are some hard facts. The team was roughly 6 people. The game's publishing was handled by Sony, but the game was not exclusive to PlayStation, nor were they operating on a AAA budget or scale. Due to the backlash, they had trouble passing how to effectively expand and improve their game, because the most vocal feedback was coming from people that were upset that Sean overpromised with the game. Because the game's hype train crashed, gamers had to find out why it crashed, and to make sense of that, they had to find a logical cause of failure, one central thing that they could blame. That being the face of the company, Sean Murray. While I think he was not above critique in this situation, he did not deserve the torrent of abuse and frequent run-ins with the police that people got him involved with. The vocal critics in the gaming community that hounded him simply could have said that it was irresponsible and deplorable to mislead people and make them waste their hard-earned cash, but instead we saw relentless attacks on Sean and Hello Games under the guise of holding the company accountable. Yes, Sean Murray, and by effect, Hello Games misled the public, but the ceaseless torrent of abuse left no room for the company to make it right. Even if they were actively working on the game to make it better, which they have actively expanded the game for the last 7 years free of charge, even beyond the scope of the original promises. Perhaps it's a hot take, but a team of 6 people isn't going to be able to make things right as quickly as a company with like 300 employees in the AAA space. I will say that one of the largest reasons that people were motivated to go this far, and while I don't agree with the reasoning, was that it was frustratingly difficult to refund the game. If you bought digital, you basically had to go through the motions and pray that customer support took mercy on you. On Steam, you have a 2-week time frame in which to request a refund, and if you exceed 2 hours of playtimes, you're usually out of luck unless the backlash is extensive surrounding a game. The only special exception I've ever seen for a game on Steam was Cyberpunk 2077, which was a technical mess as well. On PlayStation, only people who have in-game technical issues can request a refund, and as someone who's tried to refund something on PSN before, including an accidental yearly charge for PS Plus, you will get railroaded like crazy on it, and they usually won't acquiesce if the game boots up and runs, even if it does crash a lot. Xbox has a similar refund policy to Steam, with 2 weeks or 2 hours being the limitation, but if you speak to a customer service representative, I have been able to get refunds on things with technical issues within like a day, but your mileage may vary. From Hello Games' perspective, it would not be easy to make a PSA or make a firm commitment to improve the product in the court of public opinion, because in their eyes, you will only ever be guilty. Despite this, Hello Games committed themselves to realizing what they wanted to make the game into, while taking into account feedback from players who actually had dozens if not hundreds of hours in the game, so they could improve the gameplay flow and make the systems better. The key lesson I take away from No Man's Sky's failure is not merely that Sean Murray lied, but that the weight of expectations carries obligations that you as a dev do not necessarily want to fulfill. Sean got carried away and heavily misrepresented what the game would be at launch, but it only exacerbated a problem with hype. I think that regardless of what was promised, the game would have had backlash because of the expectations people had from the product. It's really common in the gaming space to place unreasonable expectations on something being the savior of a genre or things like that. People acted this way about Cyberpunk, they acted this way in the MMO community about New World and Lost Ark, and now they're acting like that about Ashes of Creation. I don't think any one game is going to magically come out and be meteoric in terms of its rise, just because you want it to. Hello Games didn't grovel for forgiveness every day until the game was good, they just made the game into something that they could feel proud of. I think Hello Games knows that they got in over their head, because that rocket ship to the moon that they had built was far outpacing their own development timeline. A hype train comes with immense pressure to deliver, and even if Sean Murray didn't stumble his way through those interviews, the innovative and groundbreaking space sim with every feature ever and unlimited gameplay was never going to satisfy critics and consumers. Even if the game was more technically polished and launched with more supposed features that it was supposed to have, the reverence of the idea of what No Man's Sky could be played an integral role in shaping the public's disappointment. Now that the game is good, people will whitewash it and say that it's purely because they wanted a good game that they acted this way. But we know from experience that this isn't true. Games like Anthem or Fallout 76 released today to be very mediocre or bad, and people still fixate on how much of a train wreck they are, and how they failed to live up to the hype without grand promises and some specific developer to blame. There's a kind of morbid curiosity in seeing these train wrecks and getting invested in them, not for any stakes or anything like that, but just because people like seeing this unfold. I play a lot of Apex Legends, and the community can be incredibly toxic in direct replies to random developers that have nothing to do with the specific gripes being levied at them. I feel that the gaming community can just be completely unreasonable towards devs. It's just that in the case of No Man's Sky, they had a get out of jail for free card to enable their toxicity, while operating under the guise of keeping developers accountable. To be clear, a hype train crashing is often a form of shade and fraud in the gaming community, as we are collectively addicted to talking about games that ultimately fumble their design goals. We saw it with Cyberpunk 2077 in 2020, Anthem in 2019, Fallout 76 in 2018, and Star Wars Battlefront 2 in 2017. I would wager that some of the people that are engaging and holding the devs accountable are not actually invested in playing or seeing the game become good. They just need a new piñata to beat with a stick. I think that at the end of it all, the fan response is the thing that's most intriguing to me. I don't really care if Sean Murray lied. Like, yes, it sucks and that should be held to account, but every single year a new game comes out and is just atrocious. And it's almost part of a content cycle that people love looking at train wreck games, like they don't care if the game is good or not. In the case of No Man's Sky's failure and gradual resurgence, it is an indie development cautionary tale that thankfully has a happy ending that flipped the script. But it does speak to the overall pressure that hype trains exert over any game regardless of their budget or scope. A lot of people who didn't give up on the botched mess of a launch were the people that actually helped the game become what it is today.
For instance, we learned that the most toxic commentary, about 80 to 90% of it, was coming from people who weren't really invested in the game. They were talking online about topics that are very common and very recognizable and most games become a lightning rod for, like pre-orders or marketing or whatever. They aren't providing good data to you as a developer. That is where a lot of press and prominent voices focus, but we actually began to uncover the ground truth underneath that. The second most negative cohort of players was actually people who had played the game for about 100 hours in the first week. And their feedback was actually incredibly useful. Suddenly, from this overwhelming noise of millions of hot takes, we discovered some ground truth, some real incredibly clear signals, like 37% of people were stopping playing or frustrated in playing just because they didn't like the inventory system. And suddenly you're like, that I can fix. I can sit down at my computer and I can fix that. Not just that, I agree with you. And now we know what we're doing. We're back making games for people who want to play them.
Because sending endless abuse didn't actually help them learn what was wrong with the game. which shows you the difference between meaningful critique and just saying, you lied, and constantly harassing the devs that want to make it better. One of the weirdest things that modern games do is advertise an attention to detail to hype up a game. Don't get me wrong, great and deep mechanics can make or break a lot of different genres, but I'm talking about the technical details of an inane nature like realistic digestion mechanics or elaborate clothing systems that don't really add much to the core of what the game is about. The reason it annoys me is not because I'm going to be off-put by its presence, it's that it doesn't come from nowhere. Why do higher-ups push for such an insane attention to detail in games where the impact is probably going to be a dot point in a top 10 minor details list on a YouTube video? Well, the generic answer is money. Those tiny details might showcase the care put into making a game, which motivates more sales. Games are an industry, and while you can wax on about keeping artistic integrity and creative ideas intact, most major studios do intend to turn a profit from their works. It makes sense. If you sell a lot of copies of a game, you get to keep the lights on, you get to keep making games, and so on and so forth. That would be a reasonable profit motive if this was true in the way that we think it is. In the AAA gaming space, nobody makes a product to break even. They want it to push units, they want to sell a lot of copies, and they want to go beyond a one-to-one investment. The more they can distribute money to shareholders, the more likely it is that the product goes forward. Labor in the games industry often leverages contract workers that work in things like quality assurance and even supporting the main game devs, but rarely ever do these contract workers become full-time employees. This might seem reasonable on the surface, but not when a person's working on a game for like 9 months to 2 years and then they have to act as external support with no employee benefits whatsoever during that time. Leading up to the release of a game, workers are crunching, and many of them are not being paid to do so. Speaking from experience, a lot of white-collar jobs that give you a salary do not give you overtime bonuses because the overtime is more or less expected to keep the workflow intact. It's an unspoken rule that you have to crunch during certain periods, and going home early without a good reason feels eerily difficult to do. Even if you do go home and work on your project some more, you're kind of expected to stay because if you leave you might get fired for not trying as hard as everybody else. Even though you put in 40-hour work weeks on the clock, it's pretty ugly, but it is in fact normalized. This is how game studios exploit passion. If you put the crappy work culture, the profit motive, and the mediocre workers' rights in the games development field, you kind of have a Jaeger bomb for disaster when you measure up what it takes to live up to hype. Take Naughty Dog for example. They used to be one of my favorite developers, and Uncharted 2 is one of my favorite games ever. In my previous video, I talked about how much I love The Last of Us 1, but I pointed out that crunch is leveraged in order to complete their games. Most developers use crunch. I've always disliked the phrase attention to detail because I could really care less if a horse in a game takes a realistic dump in it, or if there's realistic bruising that occurs after you get into physical combat. These are all technical details that are really superfluous, like I don't think they really add anything to the experience. When a game has something like elaborate rope physics, on its own it seems kind of inane, but when you think about someone spending a lot of overtime polishing up those details, so that reviewers and gamers alike can go, wow, look at the attention to detail on a Twitter video, and then never think about it again, I really wonder whether implementing and refining such details are even worth it. Crunch is already really bad in practice, and people get overworked during regular periods because it's normal to do in their industry, but that doesn't mean it's absolutely necessary. I realize that developers have obligations to their publishers, shareholders, and investors, and that pushes them to release games within a certain time frame to add value to the company and generate revenue. But there is a very human cost to all of that people are all too ready to put aside if they can derive even the most minuscule amount of enjoyment out of it. I'm just gonna say it, one of the worst games for this is Red Dead Redemption 2. The composition of just about everything in that game is fantastic. The story is powerful, the voice acting is stellar, the graphics are crazy, and everything bundled together just has a level of technical presentation and polish that most games don't have. But that doesn't mean I think all games should be made like that. The game was in development for like 8 years, and the core mechanics and overall story and other technical details were swapped around a lot in that time. I don't think that any critic, any gamer, or anyone at all can really say whether it paid off if we don't even fathom 1% of what the devs went through to make it real. Who did it pay off for? I mean, certainly not the developers who get off work late, sleep like crap before pulling another 10, 11, 12-hour day. And the thing about these work conditions is that people are really apprehensive about revealing this information to people, because people that work in games need their job, and they can't just ask to be treated better because they don't have that kind of bargaining power. It's really stupid that project managers want to put all these inane minor details in, and as consumers we celebrate that attention to detail. It's not wrong to appreciate when a game has cool minor details, and I'm not saying you advocate for the abuse of workers if you like those things. But I am saying that when we play any game, it's easier for us to take for granted the sacrifice that others have made, and hell, it makes it easy to speak about something with reverence, because it ends up being an impactful experience to us that we cannot even fathom 1% of the exhausting late nights pulled to make it live up to the hype. Forgive me for saying this, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say that game devs should be able to go home after an 8 or 9 hour workday and see their loved ones and de-stress at home. I think you'd have to lack some basic empathy for their work conditions if you don't believe they're entitled to that much. I'll say this since I see the take a lot, just because you're not doing a lot of physical labor in game development, that doesn't mean the work isn't taxing on your arms, joints in your hands, and not just that, but the mental labor being done is usually very specific and professional. Coding isn't just envisioning an idea and it magically codes itself. I think that those game devs should be allowed to go home. If living up to the hype means that we have to have developers stressed out, losing sleep, and barely separated from their work, then I don't really want it. The issue isn't even developer efficiency, it's that deadlines are honestly quite unrealistic. I feel like in the past, games were afforded more time to, cook in the oven and really come into its own. But a lot of new games are developed in under 3 years now, which is actually very concerning for the developers who work at a studio. I think we need to reassess our relationship with hype cycles with video games, and how we view game releases. I would rather that developers avoid crunch and live long and healthy lives. But in case you need a reminder, The Last of Us 2 crunched, Red Dead Redemption 2 crunched, Cyberpunk 2077 crunched and barely functional at launch. Crunch is an inseparable part of AAA game development today. And I'm not saying that it's good, I'm saying it's unsustainable. It doesn't seem that unsustainable to the people in suits because people can just quit en masse and then they get replaced by contract workers who need the work, that won't voice their discomfort. Some notable companies that I know of that don't crunch their developers are Digital Extremes, who make the extremely successful live service game Warframe, Supergiant, who made Hades and Bastion and Transistor, and I believe that in 2020 Chad Grenier revealed that Respawn had a no crunch policy, but I don't know if that's changed. In a time where binge models for content are being popularized through things like Netflix, and it's easier than ever to jump from game to game with Xbox Game Pass, I don't think I need to ask whether the psychology of how we view games has been morphed by a desire to jump between one hype thing to the next, to be driven by a fear of missing out. I think that gamers and publishers want more and more frequently, so it's time we take a look at the untamable beast that is the live service model for gaming and what it really means to sustain that hype. The biggest poison to modern gaming is games as a service. A game that constantly updates in exchange for monetization like loot boxes, battle passes, or rotating stores where skins or other content disappear for indeterminate amounts of time, so you gotta get in while it's there because you don't know if it's coming back. I love live service games for the most part. I've been playing free-to-play multiplayer games since I was in elementary school. I've played games like RuneScape, MapleStory, Five for Fun, and any number of old school games that sometimes had pay-to-win mechanics. But I don't think that all live service games are handled in a way that I generally agree with, even the ones that I play. Maintaining a game's cultural relevance now is often a function of how much it updates combined with its marketing budget and having content spread around on social media and things like that. You always see articles saying that a game has lost 99% of its players since release, and while that can be an indictment of a multiplayer-only game, reaching its retained player count as opposed to an inflated one, it's kind of stupid to leverage such an argument against something like Elden Ring or Cult of the Lamb. If anything, a lot of those articles don't really have anything to say because a lot of the time it just means people beat the game, they settled on a point they wanted to drop it and move on to something else. No game is really meant to be a forever game, and a lot of the most popular titles that are played years after their release, or even decades, don't have user retention mechanics like battle passes or seasons. They usually have things like a modding community and sometimes YouTube creators that make regular uploads about the series, that remind people why they like a game and things like that. Overall, a game doesn't really need a content engine to be relevant to some people. Skyrim has the most dedicated modding scene and a super active subreddit for people that regularly reinstall and discuss how they're going to play the game next. You can say a lot about Bethesda, but at least they've never successfully turned one of their games into a live service game. Right?
Almost heaven, West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains, Shenandoah. country roads take me home to the place I belong. West Virginia, Mountain Mama, take me home, country roads.
The number one resource that developers are competing for in modern gaming is your time. If you work or study, you probably don't have that much effective free time on your hands. So when it comes to multiplayer experiences, you really have to pick and choose what games you're gonna play. The name of the game these days is retaining attention by drip-feeding time-limited rewards through seasonal battle passes, rotating shops, and limited time events, to make sure that you don't even have a single second to think about a different game. Let's start with a big one, battle passes. I like Valve games, but I'd be kind of a hypocrite if I didn't acknowledge the role that they play in shaping modern gaming. They didn't invent loot boxes, but their TF2 and CSGO crate and key systems are definitely some of the earliest iterations of what we understand today as loot boxes. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus more on battle passes than loot boxes, so we're putting that one aside. The International 3 compendium for Dota 2 was the first battle pass. The quick and dirty is that Dota 2 funds its professional esports scene through crowdfunding, and 25% of players spending on a battle pass goes to players who make the main stage at the International, which is their global world championship, which occurs at the end of the professional circuit. During the International 3, Dota 2 broke the world record for the highest esports prize pool ever by funding through the compendium. The key idea for the compendium was that you could do things like fantasy predictions to gain rewards by predicting what teams are going to win and end up where, and the more money people spent on the compendium, more rewards were issued to the holders. With that in mind, it was not how we understood battle passes to be today. It was merely giving players the option to get additional cosmetics and support the esports scene in doing so. Hilariously enough, most games don't do this system, even though it probably would help their esports scene grow, but that's neither here nor there. Over time, the compendium would morph into the battle pass, having hundreds of levels of progression, yes, plural, in-game missions to complete, and numerous randomized cosmetics to earn over the set period of time. The cosmetics included untradeable items like Special Arcanas, which are high rarity skins with special overhauls for different heroes, Immortals, which are battle pass cosmetics that can be sold and traded for after the fact, and all of this was helping the esports scene thrive. While most battle passes in games don't fund anything, most games realized how much you can create habits in people by forcing them to try and complete battle passes because they're only available for a set amount of time. And once they're gone, they're usually gone forever, the only notable exceptions being Deep Rock Galactic, which is awesome because the developers care about that game, and Halo Infinite, which sucks because the challenges are excruciating. The Battle Pass would become mainstreamed in 2017 with the success of Fortnite Battle Royale, which iterated on the formula of Arma 2 Battle Royale, H1Z1, and PUBG. From the meteoric success of Fortnite came an unending torrent of Battle Passes in gaming. Every single new live service game usually runs a battle pass, even when they do have things like loot boxes or gacha mechanics in them. Battle passes are predicated on the idea of capturing your attention for a set period of time, but the thing is that battle passes don't have downtime. When one ends, a new one begins. That's true of Apex Legends, that's true of Fortnite, that's true of every major game that has them. So to what end are battle passes capturing your attention? Because it isn't to make money, at least not directly. Battle passes generally give you enough premium currency to buy the next battle pass so you own them in perpetuity, giving you a lifetime membership to a game and its additional progression indefinitely. Notable exception are mobile games which don't do that, Halo Infinite and Overwatch 2, all of which force you to shell out for each battle pass with no currency refunds. When you become enfranchised or immersed with any property, it's easy to convince yourself that, well, I play a lot so I can throw some money at it, and this is crazy effective at retaining players. Ask any Fortnite player how much they've spent on the game, and even if they're well adjusted and got a 9 to 5, you'll see the palpable apprehension in answering the question. The same would be true if you asked me how much I've spent on Apex skins, and my rationale will be, well, I've played regularly for almost 4 years, but that's because I'm stuck inside of the trap. When you can retain the hype of your game through regular updates and seasonal content, it becomes increasingly difficult to be critical of the paradigm you're stuck inside of. But the more general problem for gaming becomes this. Nobody has infinite time, so they might be coerced into spending more to finish a battle pass. Suddenly, a $10 purchase becomes a $25 purchase because they need those extra levels to finish during a busy work season. And detractors will say, well, you can just not buy a battle pass. But then you're missing out, so you almost feel compelled to do it even though you know you reasonably should not, based on your own time constraints. What's worse is that multiple games have battle passes, so all the games around you are pulling you towards them, eating up all of your free time with progression tracks that no human on Earth has the time to complete. This cannot be sustainable, and it's not even an exercise in self-restraint most of the time. When everyone you know and watch is on something, it becomes more and more difficult to just drop something even if you can't play it a lot. Companies build up hype by putting out extravagant trailers and relying on influencers to jump on a new season and bring old and new eyes to it, putting up new limited time cosmetics and leveraging the fear of missing out to make sure you aren't going anywhere. But people are getting tired of games as a service. Plenty of new games released just to die or shut down in a very short period of time. They can't just carry on as usual. You know what's radical these days? Releasing a game that actually just starts and ends. And on that note, have you played a Ubisoft game recently? Most of them have little to no multiplayer content, but they will have things like in-game ads, rotating shops, and I saw this in Assassin's Creed and Phoenix Rising, and I was straight up baffled. If you think of all the current Ubisoft games that you hear about with some regularity, you might be hearing about The Division, or For Honor, though those two not as much, Rainbow Six Siege, Far Cry, Assassin's Creed, and most of those things have live service mechanics in them, besides Far Cry. Let's point out the obvious. When something remains hype for longer, you can extract more money out of gamers. We're past the point of reasonable monetization like expansion packs or eventual DLCs. We're now in the era of day one season passes, pre-order bonuses, microtransactions, and a full price game, and just owning a game is difficult. More and more games are online only because of unnecessary features. Look at Back 4 Blood. That was online only, and for the most part, the game's systems overcomplicated the Left 4 Dead formula by stripping out the modding capabilities and making it an RPG without any option to mod the game in a whimsical and fun way that people used to do in Left 4 Dead 2. Guess what won't come to that game? New content, because modding isn't an option. So it can't achieve immortal status like Left 4 Dead or Skyrim. The cynical aspect of live service games is that you don't need to make a million sales to make millions of dollars. Instead, you can just monetize the crap out of the average player so you could have 100,000 people who spend on the game, and you might unironically make more than selling 1 million copies of a $15 game. You can be a less popular product that makes way more at the cost of the player experience. I play him, so I guess I'm enabling part of the problem, but here's the cruel truth. We can either be part of the cultural zeitgeist and play everything that our friends are playing, or we can miss out. We're basically strong-armed into be culturally in touch with gaming if we choose to play multiplayer games nowadays. It's really hard to just own something you buy now. Everything is cynically designed to keep you coming back with season passes, battle passes, and the updates aren't even months apart but days or weeks. We're in a time where publishers want us to want more so they can monetize us more frequently. And when we want more, we get charged more. Not just that, we force developers to keep up the pace without really receiving anything equitable in exchange. The biggest live service game by scale is Fortnite, you know? Maybe it's not churning numbers on Twitch like it used to, and the YouTube numbers have kind of scaled back and Minecraft has taken over, but that game is undoubtedly the biggest live service game, and they crunch the hell out of their developers to keep the update schedule. New skins arrive daily, patching is super fast and frequent. I've seen stuff patched out of the game within hours of it being recognized. Yes, they make billions upon billions, which most games can't even fathom in terms of scale, but it means that developers get crunched like hell to keep up. I like Fortnite, it's fun and they put in collabs that are cool, but the fact that it's held mainstream attention for 6 years has probably been hell for the developers, and I really cannot see Naruto doing the gritty as a worthwhile output if it means that people have to get crunched to sustain the model of Fortnite. I'm not saying to boycott all live service games, or if you play Fortnite you're a bad person, but I sincerely hope that the industry moves towards slower content cycles. Because we're basically living at the mercy of the natural endpoint of an analytics-driven internet. Everything we do now is about appeasing the algorithm. Video titles are like me in the new Fortnite skin that just released, generating more hype and views, even when you don't even care about the skin in question. I've seen people make videos about the Naruto and Dragon Ball skins, and I know they haven't even watched those animes, so they're just doing it because it's relevant. Hype is not a reflection of value, but retaining it is an expensive and unsustainable endeavor. Epic Games and Fortnite probably won't explode tomorrow, but I do feel for the devs that will burn up and burn out quickly from having to work in such a fast-paced environment. For live services, the problem isn't living up to the hype just once, as most single-player and full-price games do. It's retaining the impression that the game hasn't slipped up and lost its consistent measure of quality. Every single second of every day, you're proving that you haven't slipped up and you haven't gotten lazy or you care about the player base. And because live services are constantly updating, the scrutiny is over every little thing that you do. If you update slower, people will say that your game is dying and you don't care anymore. If you put in less Disney or anime collabs, your game fell off, even though you're trying to rely less on external IPs to market your game. You can't choose to update slower because you are the one that set the standards that they expect from you. Nobody's out here thinking that a 2-week delay on an update for Deep Rock Galactic is an indicator that the end is nigh. But with Fortnite, I've seen numerous periods where people believe the game was dead or dying, and it's kinda like, you set unrealistic standards for yourself and expected the line to go up forever. There will be a soft cap of players that play your game, and there will be logical limits that merely upsizing your studio and the speed at which you update cannot overcome. The live service hype cycle will eventually bite games in the ass, and this is at a time when numerous live services like Avengers, Apex Mobile, Knockout City, Rumbleverse, and many others have died out before they could find their footing. Not everyone can drink from the cup of infinite money, and live service games are clearly a bubble that is currently bursting. There is a limit on how much people will spend on anything. If you launch a new live service game now, you've probably got to make a contingency plan because it's probably going to be dead on arrival. But not all hope is lost. There are still amazing games to experience that are single player, like Hi-Fi Rush, Fire Emblem Engage, God of War Ragnarok, Crisis Core Reunion. Games as a medium are not doomed because live services suck. They just point out how bad it is to try and sustain hype infinitely because it can't work like that. I think it's okay to let games start and finish. And if the game has any residual buzz, it's because the game was so good that it built a loyal and active fanbase or fandom. I think it's time that we learn to let games rest. We don't have to turn them into money printing machines. And I'm really tired of pretending that we have to do that for them to be viable products. Games that print money are only viable for shareholders. They're not viable for consumers that have weak spending power in an economic recession. I feel like something has got to give, and I hope it does soon. It's kind of an ugly thing, the beast that gaming distribution and monetization has become. But everything leads back to hype. And more people are just fed up with being at the mercy of it. Yeah, sure, people will always anticipate new games, live services, and they will always have expectations. But I think that people are starting to recognize that some things in life just can't be forced. You can't force yourself to love every new game and buy a certain amount of games per year and get every single choice correct. We've seen so many catastrophic failures not just in live services, but in single-player games that were developed for over half a decade because of poor management and extensive scope, and overall just trying to do everything in the world without considering the logistics and practicality of doing that. Games like Red Dead Redemption 2 might strike gold with their attention to detail and their overall composition, but as I said in my Games as Art video, if we make this the barrier to entry for gaming, then the whole medium suffers. Hype may be somewhat necessary for new IPs to get any sales, and deep mechanics might be required to realize the vision of what a dev wants the game to be. I'm not critical of those things on a conceptual level. I'm critical of the fact that hype plays such an integral role in gaming that generates such immense toxicity when things don't live up to what people expected. I'm annoyed that hype and satisfying the fans through passion is how studios explain why they crunch. I'm tired of live service games trying to make my very existence about engaging with them. I know I've said a lot of things, but I can't even concisely express just how annoying it is we live in a future driven by data analytics. The impressions a game has, influences needing to be leveraged in order for a game to sell a gazillion copies, and those hype metrics being thrown around as proof of value of a good game. Hype isn't everything. Even hyped games can be frankly quite awful on multiple levels. New World by Amazon Games was a technical mess that still churned numbers on Twitch and views on YouTube. Lost Ark, published by Amazon Games, was a straight up whale game that had pay-to-win mechanics, and it still gained mainstream traction, simply because it was new, and had a marketing budget with influencers farming the hell out of it despite being barely removed from a mobile game on a functional level. This is how inorganic most hype is, but hype is not inherently a bad thing. Sometimes a game has a memorable moment at a press conference, like the nervous speech for Unravel that eventually fueled a lot of the sales for the game. But that was organic, and the developer, Martin Salin, was just eager to tell the public about his game. I'm not entirely sure how well the game and its sequel sold, but this was an instance of organic hype. It wasn't planned, it wasn't forced, nor did it have an excessive marketing budget. It was kind of just a human moment, and the gaming community recognized that and appreciated it for what it is. Not a lot of things in the modern AAA gaming space can have this level of earnestness, because they have $1 million CGI trailers, billboards, excessive marketing, and other such things that make some games impossible to avoid. The indie space is constantly creating underrated yet heartfelt experiences that maybe only hundreds or thousands of people will ever experience, which is why so many gems are lying in wait. Organic hype is rare in modern gaming, and generally there's nothing wrong with that. But when generating or retaining hype is the end goal, we truly get some ugly consequences like developer crunch, over-monetization, live service systems, unrealistic expectations, and overall it's a blight on the medium. Games are an industry, so publishers want to make their bag, but I can't help but feel that the price of pursuing hype corrupts games and coerces developers to over-monetize through live service mechanics and season passes, and maybe they don't really want that, and it's more to do with the projected profits from the publishers. At the end of it all, the need to chase hype in order to remain competitive is a very complex and nuanced topic that I've only covered less than 1% of. I hope that it stimulated some thinking, and I want to hear what all of you think about the state and the future of gaming in the comments below. And if you're really brave, admit some games that you're less than proud of playing, that operate in the live service niche. I've been Meatman, and I'm sorry this video was so long and honestly quite experimental in structure, but I'm glad you stuck with me as always, and I'll catch you in the next essay. Bye. Oh, and join the Discord below. See ya.